Welcome to God Pods, faith conversations from Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Center.
Hello.
Good morning, Allison.
How are you?
I'm well, and yourself?
Good. I'm excited to be here with you.
Oh, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Finding God in poetry is something that I feel I consider personally often, but rarely have a chance to discuss. So I'm excited that we were invited to do this. And I know that a lot of the people listening will be interested in hearing about how a person becomes a poet. And so I thought maybe, you could talk a little bit about how you became a poet and how poetry has been connected to your faith.
Allison, thank you. It goes way back to the time I was a young, in my teenager, and it goes back also to the Mass. It goes back to the Latin Mass for me in the early days. The relationship between the search for God, for meaning in life, and what poetry could possibly do in terms of making that bridge closer for me. I've always been interested in history, philosophy, literature, etc., but at the heart of it has been poetry. I think that when I was in I was in a kind of proto seminary for a year up in Beacon, New York, and I wrote, I think, my first poem. It was a sonnet based on the Passion of Christ, and I won first prize, which was $10. So
That's
I
early
used that money to buy
encouragement.
a rosary for my mother. That was the beginning. I went to college at Manhattan College and took a very good class with a poet named John Fandel. It went on, but I think, Allison, that the real beginnings are in fact linked again to my faith. I saw myself as a teacher of poetry. I was teaching classes in modern poetry at Colgate, but then really at the University of Massachusetts at the time. And I made it what they call a Cursillo. And I was asked to be the rector. I was honored to be the rector. And I remember it was a 3-day intensive bonding with about 40 men. And at the end of it, I remember we went into the little tiny room where they had the Blessed Sacrament. And I remember a voice, I heard something inside my head say, "Paul asked for something." And I said, "No, I don't need any. I mean, I'm just glad to be here." And he said, the voice again said, "Ask for something." I said, "Well, if it's okay, what I would like to be is a poet. I would like to write poetry." That's what I said. I would like to write poems. And within the next 6 months, I had written an entire volume of poems. My first one, Timing Devices. That's how it began back in the late 70s. And it continued. Here I am writing poetry. I'm also writing biographies. I'm writing, reviews, essays, etc., all of that. But that was the beginning. So for me, it's always been a link between the spiritual and the poetic. Even when the poems don't seem to be spiritual, there's still that sense of the eye, the gaze of God looking at me, watching me, helping me. So that's just where I come from. That's what I do. Yeah.
I feel like growing up in some sort of Catholic tradition reminds a person that they're existing in two worlds, on the ground and then in a spiritual plane. In my own journey was much less profound in many ways. I grew up in Gettysburg, as I know you know. And so for me, I went to Catholic school, and all of our field trips were to Civil War sites. So the nuns would bring us to Civil War sites. And I have this very vivid memory of one year specifically in first grade, when my teacher, Sister Alfreda, she had told us fairly recently about the story of Saint Maria Goretti, who was this young child whose father had died. I think both of her parents maybe had died, but anyhow, she had to live in this small apartment complex in my memory with another family. And let's just say, things got hairy for her, and she was in danger of being murdered, which ultimately she was. And
Yes.
as she knew that this was coming, she sat on this set of stairs, mending the socks or mending the shirt, I think it was, of the person who was going to kill her. And this, I was in first grade. And so first of all, the stories of martyrdom are already pretty intense. But within the next few days, we went to visit the Jenny Wade house in Gettysburg. And Sister Alfreda told us to put our fingers through the bullet holes that went through the door, Jenny Wade being one of the only civilians who was killed during the Battle of Gettysburg, because she came up from the cellar to bake bread for her family and for the soldiers, and a bullet came through the kitchen door. So we would go visit this door and put our fingers through the hole. Now, of course, it's blocked with glass. To me, these things were very combined. This idea of, representation, and Jenny Wade wasn't just Jenny Wade, but she was all of the citizens in Gettysburg, and Saint Maria Goretti wasn't just herself, she was representing something. So I feel like I couldn't escape in a way. Before I even knew what a poem was, I feel like I couldn't escape the idea of metaphor. You mentioned Mass in Latin, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know myself, when I think of Mass in Latin, I think of John Keats saying that good poetry proves itself upon the pulses, that you can understand something or take in the music of it before you even comprehend it. And I was wondering, especially for listeners who have experienced Mass in Latin, if you could talk a little bit more about what attending a Mass in Latin means to you.
Yes, I not only did I have to, as a boy, learn all the phrases, all the responses in Latin. That was one thing. Ad Deum qui licificat juventutem meum. That's how it began, quoting one of the Psalms, and et cum spiritu tuo, etc. And it just, the music of the Latin oh boy, it went so deep. It was, here you have a call and response. Priest says something, the altar boy, responds for the community. And then I also took 7 years of Latin, both in high school and then through college, along with Greek. That was the language that I took. And I think that the Latin has been very important in terms of my own vocabulary, in terms of the words that get into my poetry. That's one side, I would say, the Latin side. The other side would be the William Carlos Williams side. That would be the Native American, how shall I put it, in the American grain. The language of New Jersey, for example, the language of New York City.
The Patterson.
How you get that is, so there would be a kind of a play back and forth, just as there was the play between the priest and the altar boy. There would be the play between the Anglo-Saxon, if you will, the language of the New World, plus the whole tradition going back to Homer, going back to Virgil, going back to Dante, all of that meshing together, swimming. I know you know what I'm talking about, Allison, in terms of the metaphors that you use, that kind of molecular movement, that the music, that philosophy No other language can do it for me like poetry can do it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. And I know that one of the inspirations behind our being invited to talk about this was to consider poetry in sacred texts and especially in the Bible. So, the Bible itself is filled with poetry, which people often forget, thinking of it as a set of instructions, perhaps. So I was wondering, what you think of in terms of the poems and the poetry of the Bible. Are there favorite poems essentially that you have from the Bible, or what is it that poetry in the Bible can do and can communicate that a prose piece cannot?
Yes. For me, every single day, Allison, my wife and I spend time reading the readings for that day's mass. Every day we do this in the morning, okay, along with a meditation. It takes about 20, 25 minutes to do it in the morning, okay. The I don't want to lose the grip here. The Bible, the Psalms. I keep coming back and back to the Psalms. I read them every day, and the music of them and the repetitions, and I can even see the chorus line. I can see a kind of dance moving back this way and then moving this way. The Psalms are very important. Okay. A second thing, though, that there's the Song of Songs. But I think, so much of the Bible is written. Even if it's put down on the page like prose, it still reads like poetry. Okay, and I'm sure that, well, of course, given the Hebrew, that was the case, that it was poetry. The other thing is when Christ speaks his parables, like the prodigal son, for example, he sounds like a poet. For me, what he's doing is so much more than just dictating or giving commands. There's just so much poetry in the way that the stories unfold. The sowers, sowing the fields. The angel Gabriel. Things like the Hail Mary. The Our Father. These are incredibly poetic statements. So I keep going back, I think, to those as well. Those are some, yeah.
I think sometimes what I encounter with my students who have been taught poetry in a certain kind of way or have been taught the Bible in a certain kind of way, I think to people who are coming at it through the lens of a very restrictive reading, like we have to read this passage in order to dissect it and take it apart and teach ourselves, all of the symbols and so on and so forth. I feel like the Bible as poetry can feel kind of exclusive, but you mentioned the prodigal son. To me, one of the reasons the Bible is poetry has not anything to do necessarily with form or with music, even though I also agree with you that it does, but with counterintuitive thinking and paradoxes. I remember struggling mightily with the story of the prodigal son and trying to understand how this was fair at all, and
My father used to say the same thing, Allison.
It really, as a younger sister, I think, I wondered, excuse me. So it was not necessarily lines, but also the last shall be first. And the first, all these paradoxes that lead us to transcendence, I find a real kinship between them in the Bible and in religious teachings, the great religious teachings, and in poetry. One phrase that's often associated with Robert Frost is honest duplicity. Of course, duplicity is something we usually think of as a bad thing. Something can't be itself and its opposite at the same time. You can't love something and hate something at the same time, or be afraid of it and also be drawn to it. But of course, in reality, of course you can. Of course we can love something and fear it at the same time, etc. And so this idea of honest duplicity is something that I see insisted upon again and again in poetry and in the Bible. And, I thought, are there, when you think of the Catholic intellectual tradition, what about moving outside of the Bible to other poets who write about faith, whether from inside Catholicism or outside of it? Which poets come to mind as ones that have provoked your understanding of faith?
Well, I'll tell you, I know Frost is one of your favorites, and I find just the poem that you asked me to look at, A Peck of Gold, did that for me very much. I've done 6 biographies. William Carlos Williams, who wrote "Though I'm No Catholic," okay, but it's very interesting to watch him as he approaches questions like when he has a breakdown and he writes a poem to the Blessed Mother, for example, trying to, looking for some kind of help. Or John Berryman, who goes from really breaks away. He was an altar boy, broke away from it all. But at the end, you see him coming back, trying desperately after, the breakdowns with his marriages and then the breakdowns with alcoholism and then being put in the locked wards, coming back with the 11 addresses to the Lord. I find that fascinating. What about someone like Hart Crane, for example? Gay, New York, 1920s, the roaring boy. Even in the major poems of the bridge, he keeps coming back to 2 figures. One is the Native American Pocahontas. The other is the Blessed Mother, the Blessed Virgin. And he keeps coming back to it. He needs this strong mother symbol, image. What about someone like Wallace Stevens, who in Sunday Morning back in 1913, 1914, pretty much says that the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream, for example, where he says, enjoy what you can while you can because you're going to die, okay? As he gets older, he says, well, let me rethink that one, okay? And so you find him going back to Santayana, for example, the philosopher Santayana, who had been his teacher at Harvard. And when Santayana passes, when he dies, Stevens recreating that scene in Rome where Santayana died, and wondering, what is the possibility of transcendence, of something more, in our lives that meaningful. So I find that all of the poets that I've done, all 6 of them, and of course Father Hopkins, who is a model for me, really, obviously, but all of them, it's always that, there's a search. They need something more. What it is, they may not know, but it's a mystery. But they go after it. They keep coming with their poems, coming back to it and coming back to it. And that's what I find so fascinating. I find that also true. Someone I wish I had written a biography, Flannery O'Connor. So she's incredible with what she does. A good man is hard to find, for example. The grandmother facing death and then reaching out to the person who has just killed her family. I just find just pushing as you say, Allison, pushing the envelope, that complex, quote, duplicity that you spoke of. Yeah, that it's there every time I write, when I write, and I know you do this, Allison, there's this, but there's also this, and then the mesh between them. And that, how do you, if not reconcile them, how do you place them on the page so that the mind can see the alternatives and then make its choice, or however one. decides to quote resolve it, if that's the way. Probably not even resolution, just at least it's there. I mean, for example, in A Peck of Gold, where the children are taught that, oh, that's gold that they're eating out there, and it's just dust. And besides, do you eat gold? I mean, I remember there was one emperor they forced molten gold down his throat. I mean, it didn't help. So
I feel like that would not encourage a kind of benign response. As a method, it might be sort of strident. But you and I talked previously about Mass and the repetition involved in Mass and sacramental practices as being an invitation to revisioning something, to reconsidering something. And I love that idea of repetition and incantation as a kind of catalyst toward inquiry. I mean, part of the Catholic intellectual tradition is faith as a catalyst for inquiry. And it seems like part of what you're describing here is that in visiting something and in raising questions about it, one is led toward more insight about faith, and in revisiting material, one is led toward more questions. I love, to what you said, I love this, the contemporary poet Jericho Brown, who tried to describe a situation he had in encouraging a friend who was a jazz musician to read more poetry. And so he gave the friend some poetry, and the friend said, I don't understand it. I don't get it. I believe you that it's good, but I don't get it. And so Jericho Brown said, well, when you listen to Thelonious Monk, the first time you don't understand it or try to sort of cogitate, you just say, I dig it. I like it. And then you move on. And then, as he says, the next time you listen, you say, I still like it, but I noticed something else. And then you come back a third time and you say, oh, I noticed something else. And you begin to accumulate this enhanced understanding, this deeper knowledge of sort of what it is. And when I read that, I was thinking about how you said that Mass itself and a kind of repetitive sacramental practice can bring that kind of new knowledge, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow, very well put, Allison. Yes.
Credit to Jericho Brown for that.
Well, yes, I mean, that's brilliant what Jericho Brown says there. You hear the music, you hear Thelonious Monk, something about it, you keep coming back to it. Each time you come back to it, just as with a poem. I mean, how many times you read the same poem and it gets deeper and deeper, something new. And, I was just thinking, for example, Mass, we've just been through, we're through COVID time here, right? And you think every single Sunday when my wife and I go to Mass, how you hear the homilies and and you hear young people saying, boring, it's but listen to what they're saying. Listen, just if you could just pay attention, which is what I think the act of love is. Just pay attention and see how deeper and deeper it can go. And then, of course, you're a different person each week. You had needs last week that by midweek they were solved, or you went on beyond them. So now you've got other issues, and that's going to continue right up until the end. There are going to be issues all the way along the line. You had issues when you were in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. So, it's like. We'll be married, my wife and I, nearly 60 years, okay? 60 years. So it never grows old to say, I love you. Never. It never grows old. Every single day. And I wake up and I say, my God, she's still here, and I'm still here. And pay attention, just be thankful for what you have. There are 1,000 blessings out there. One of the old rabbinical sayings is, 1,000 blessings every day. So but you have to be aware of them. I look out the window there, and there are these warblers and these gold-colored birds right outside the window, and they're looping, flying up and down, and it's wow, look at that. Or I'm out in the garden, just working with my flowers. I look at this dahlia. Look at the deep purples, and then how they get lighter and lighter. I mean, I couldn't even paint that, and there it is for nothing, right in front of me. So I think,
like some sort of cosmic gift.
yes, exactly, a cosmic. Thank you, Alice. That's
I came across this story about the poet Osip Mandelstam, who probably the last poem he wrote, though he might have written poems later that day, the last day before he was transferred to Siberia and essentially never heard from again. Stalin seemed pretty intimidated by his wild interrogation of faith. But Osip Mandelstam, in his last poem, and this is in a translation from Christian Wyman, he said something very similar to what you're saying, Paul. In his poem, he says, "And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf-like and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me."
wow.
And you
Wow.
think
Yeah.
this person who is about to be transferred to a work camp in Siberia, never to write again, at least on paper, is experiencing the thrill of this gift and the magic and the mystery of, the kind of creation of the world. And I just find that inspiring, a word that I feel like is shunned often today, but just really mystifying, in terms of what it reflects about his faith and his ability to see through the challenges that you were describing.
Wow. Yes, that is beautiful. There it is. He's going off to Siberia, and those are his last lines that we have. Yes, and what a gift! What a gift for the rest of us. We go through our own downturns, and a poem like that can lift us up. It's a gift to us all these years later, and that's another thing that poetry can do for us. Yeah.
Well, in your book, you say, and here I've got a quote here: "Beauty and wonder are not mere accidents caught in the glimmer of light and darkness, but something more, signs of God's presence, the mystery in and with and through the great design that has always been there, but has to be instressed upon our mind and more upon our hearts." I was thinking a little bit about in the American tradition of religion, how initially there was someone like the revivalist Jonathan Edwards who said, "Oh, in the rose bush, the thorns are Christ's passion and the rose is Christ's glory." And then you have the transcendentalists who say, "No, we're all one and natural objects are the same as God," and all of this stuff. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the writing process itself, writing in form or out of form, how the writing process itself leads you to this sense of beauty and wonder. So transitioning out of the thematic stuff and into the actual writing process and the act of creation.
Yeah. Boy, that is so true, Allison. You look at the blank page before you, and you wait, then you write down the one line, and the line often surprises you. So it leads to a second line, and you're off somewhere. It's sort of like a deep prayer. Okay, now there's another line, and then it's like a gift, Allison. I mean, you may have had the first line, but you didn't have the second, but it comes to you. Where's it coming from? And then a third line, and then et cetera. Allison, this new book that I just wrote this year that'll be coming out early next year. Okay, First Light Last. On New Year's of this year, I promised myself with the COVID and all that I would write one line of poetry a day, one line. Okay, and I kept to that. Now, what would happen is sometimes it was just one line if it was a down day. Other days it'd be two lines, and two lines led to four lines. 4 lines led to 8 lines, a stanza, etc. And it just kept growing and growing, so that by May, I had a book of 33 poems. That's never really ever happened to me before. Now, of course, each morning I also said my, prayers, Lord, if it's your will, help me with this. And, but it worked. How did it, I can't explain exactly how it worked, but it did work. One line leads to another, and you're in a dialogue, and you're in a different world, Allison. It's not like the 9 to 5 job. This is a special world. It's like the world of meditation. It's a deeper world, and somehow you either unlock it or it unlocks you. It unlocks you, and you move from there. But it works. Yeah.
Well, I love this idea, and I feel like it's a gift you've given us and everyone who's listening to think of, incremental practice as something that leads to an entire, that leads to the whole. Even if you just sort of take a step and keep, thinking about something or writing a line, that it can accumulate into something greater than itself. I want to just ask you one final question before we go here, and that is one poem that you would leave everyone with to turn to when they are looking for some sort of sense of spiritual connection.
Yes, it would be probably Father Hopkins. Okay, it would be something like God's Grandeur. My very favorite poem in the whole world, though, is The Wind Hover. The Wind Hover sonnet. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dolphin, dappled dawn, drawn full in his riding of the rolling level underneath him. It's just, you can feel the mimesis, you can feel the movement of the wind hover as the wind moves, and it works with the spirit. It works with the wind, and then it leads to what? It leads to not just to the heights, but it leads to the crucifixion, and then the resurrection from the burnt embers as they flare up into fire again. It's just a poem that's just touched me ever since I was 20 years old. Yeah.
Years ago, not my own student, but in graduate school, a friend's student said to her about Emily Dickinson, I don't understand her here. And she touched her head, but I understand her here. And she touched not her heart, but her gut. And I think Hopkins and that poem is such a great example of a way that people can sort of get in touch with a kind of indwelling, spiritual response to poetry. Paul Mariani, I can't thank you enough for talking with me about finding God in poetry. And I hope people will go out and find poetry in their days today, just like you and I do every day.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for your own spirit and your own work so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
For more Catholic Faith resources, follow us at bc.edu/C21 or via Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.